All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to the College of Social Sciences and Public Policy Pub at FSU. We are calling it this year the Pubinar for obvious reasons, since we can't meet and greet like we usually do at Backwoods Bistro down by campus. I am the host for this evening. I'm Dina Rollinger. I'm one of the associate deans in the College of Social Sciences at Florida State. If you are new to the pub, welcome. What pubs do is we try to connect faculty, students, and community members together in interesting conversations about the important issues of the day. So typically how these go is our speaker, Dr. Casserleigh, tonight will talk for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll have question and answer. So how we're working this in the virtual form is you will notice somewhere on your device, you will see a Q&A button. So I'm asking you to please type out your question if you are able. You can do that at any time during her discussion, but we'll take them at the end. I will also periodically try to stop and during the Q&A portion and see if anyone needs to raise a hand and ask a question live instead. So please participate that way. Please don't use the chat because that's just too many forms for us to monitor at one time. So I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Audrey Casserleigh. She is a professor in our wonderful Emergency Management and Homeland Security program here at FSU. She is also a senior fellow at the Center for Disaster Risk Policy. She's an expert on many things, but tonight she'll be talking about her expertise on the organizational behavior of terrorist networks. And her title of the talk this evening is The Intended Consequences, the Role of Fringe Movements in Civil Unrest. And I will turn it over to Dr. Casserleigh.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and welcome everybody. I am here today to talk about some fringe movements in the United States. And I am really hoping this will incite great conversation. So let's go ahead and get started. As you know, the United States is such a dynamic political environment. And into this environment, we have a lot of mainstream ideas, and then we have some fringe movement ideas. And this presentation is really intended to look at a couple of organizations that are what we would call violent extremist groups. And a violent extremist group is really one that not only advocates the use of violence for their purpose or their cause, but acts on that violence too. And when we look at the groups I'm going to present this evening, I need you to understand this is not all of the groups. There are several groups out there that run the spectrum of political ideologies. Predominantly right now in the United States, when we look at violent groups, we're mostly talking about far-right movements. And I've included some information at the bottom of the first slide about other organizations that I know sometimes are referred to as violent extremist groups, but haven't necessarily conducted violence. Excuse me, you have got to stop. So for example, I know that the White House has called for a federal investigation into Antifa, and they didn't quite make the cut tonight because to date, Antifa has not used actual violence, murder or attempted murder to further their cause, but the groups we are going to look at have. So the basic concept behind a lot of these fringe movements is a sort of bifold philosophy. First is born of suspicion. There is a general idea in these organizations that something is going on that isn't being reported, that there's more behind the story. And a lot of this gives rise to some conspiracy theories. And some of the information from these groups is received by fringe information sources like QAnon. The other part of this fringe ideology is really that the system, in this case governance, has failed, and only the individual actor or the fringe organization can right the wrong that they perceive. And so as you can imagine, this is not necessarily a commonplace occurrence. the desire to pick up weapons to address a grievance against your governance is a little bit rare. So let's take a look at a couple philosophies. We're going to be talking predominantly about three groups tonight: the Boogaloo movement, Sovereign Citizens, and the Proud Boys. Those are three groups that have been in the media a lot and are considered some of the greatest domestic security threats by the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI. One of the concepts behind some of these groups is acceleration. A lot of right-wing violent extremist groups have a very strong adherence to white nationalist values. And in their thinking, a civil war or possibly a race war or a war between civilians and the government is inevitable. And it's their job to accelerate this happening. And they believe quite sincerely that it's not if, it's just a matter of when, and that they should absolutely be prepared for whatever civil war that they perceive to be occurring. And this is a very common thread through a lot of extremist organizations. There's another term that we like to use, and that's agent provocateur. And that's somebody who really is inciting or trying to contribute to the accelerationist philosophy. And you see this sort of idea fitting in nicely with some of the more extreme media outlets. For example, I have an image here from One America News. It's a very conservative news outlet. And they had this piece that was basically framing a coup attempt against the sitting government. These are things that the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI take very, very seriously. But you can also understand that media acts as an agent provocateur. There's also some very interesting data about right-wing violence and death in the United States. And I've included some numbers. But the big takeaway that you need to take, at least for me, is that right now in this country, when we talk about left-wing groups or right-wing groups, death or attempted murder is more common in right-wing groups than in left-wing groups. And throughout my presentation, I've included all kinds of links to support documentation for where I found my information. So let's talk about some of these groups because they're so fascinating. One of my favorites is the Boogaloo. Now, the Boogaloo is a very interesting term. It basically means a violent uprising against the federal government. So it's like an insider term, the Boogaloo, right? The Boogaloo Boys are a very complex group of individuals. And I say that they're complex because a lot of members cross a lot of different ideas. Some of the Boogaloo believe that the federal government has failed and that they need to step in and help create civil order. And along those lines, some Boogaloo actually support Black Lives Matter and other civil unrest organizations. They see their role as picking up where law enforcement has failed. And in many ways, that's a very leftist leaning perspective. But what makes them so complicated is that they're also 100% accelerationists. They are definitely looking for that civil conflict between the federal government and armed civilians. And they are completely comfortable advocating for the inevitability of that and the role that they need to play. And they use, like many extremist organizations, they use some of their own new language system. And I've got some examples there in the slides. And some of these are old terms. Racial holy war is an old term that was that's been used by separatist groups for a long time. So the Boogaloo is a little bit unique too, in that their violence crosses a lot of different genres. They've been arrested for inciting civil unrest. They've been arrested for targeting law enforcement. They've also been arrested for bringing violence to otherwise peaceful protests. There's quite a few examples of the Boogaloo who overlap, interestingly, with former military members and sometimes even law enforcement. And that's a new area of interest for both researchers and federal officers, is some of that overlap between extremist organizations and civil protection organizations, like law enforcement organizations. Like I mentioned before, what makes the Boogaloo interesting is they really do span the gamut. And you can see from that picture in the top right, they were there to support the George Floyd protesters. So they were on the side of Black Lives Matter in acting as agent provocateurs against the police. The Sovereign Citizens is another group I really want to talk about. And that's because they have been so comfortable with violence against law enforcement personnel. They've been active for a very long time, and they have some very complicated ideas about what and who is a citizen and what or who is responsible for taxation in this country. They do a lot of what we call paper terrorism, but what makes them so scary is their comfort with actual violence. In fact, we're here in Tallahassee, Florida, and there's a relatively famous incident involving a sovereign citizen in 2014, where they raised the false flag of a house fire. First responders came, and then they took that opportunity to shoot at the first responders. So sovereign citizens are very aggressive and very violent towards what they see as uniformed or other representatives of the US government. And they also go after things like sitting judges, they'll go after elected officials, and really they're on this list because of their absolute comfort with violence. I also, of course, want to mention the Proud Boys. They've been in the news quite a bit lately. They are a self-ascribed chauvinist organization. Their platform is very end of world. They are definitely an accelerationist perspective. They do believe that war inside the United States is coming, and that everybody should have a gun, and that the Proud Boys will defend what they perceive to be traditional white nationalist values. Now, interestingly, while they definitely have a white supremacist origin, a lot more minorities are attracted to the Proud Boys. And they're also not afraid of being readily identifiable. They have a bit of a uniform, if you will. They wear these black polo shirts with yellow piping, the Fred Perry polo shirt, and quite often body armor and MAGA hats. And then in the picture, you can see a Proud Boy wearing both the shirt I just described, what they call a Fred Perry polo, and an Antifa hunting sticker. And what's interesting about the Proud Boys is that they have a very specific target that they are interested in agitating with. If you look at their sort of loosely ascribed initiation process, at the 4th degree, you actually, to be a Proud Boy, have to engage in violence with a member of Antifa. So this is a clear case where we see one fringe element intentionally inciting violence against another element. And I don't think that it is unknown that the Proud Boys are one of the FBI's greatest concerns as far as organized right-wing radicals. They have been banned from most social media platforms because of their xenophobic and racist expressions. And they tend to attend rallies, and they tend to be agent provocateurs. They are absolutely committed to taking peaceful protests and trying to engage in a violent way. They definitely want to incite that violence inside of protesting. The Department of Homeland Security has clearly identified them as one of the primary concerns when we look at attacks on some seated representatives of government. There's a couple other organizations that I didn't include in this presentation, but they're big. One of the bigger ones is the National Socialist Movement and the Shield Wall Network. And many of these organizations have found their cause du jour in fighting against the Black Lives Matter protest. And when we dig a little deeper into what really their concern is, it's interesting that most of them are concerned that the protest, regardless of its purpose, just the protest itself and the members who may be protesting, will bring disruption. So it's not necessarily the specific ideas behind certain movements that they find aggravating. It's actually the presence just of the movements that they find aggravating and inspiring. There's a quote here that I've included, and you can see that in this case, the antagonist isn't really concerned about the cause of the movement. He's just concerned about people in his area. And if that occurs, then he's going to be picking up weapons to defend what he perceives as, his rights. There are several events that always precipitate a rise in hate groups. As you can well imagine, the election of our first African-American president was a reason for many hate groups to find new members. And recently, we have seen a bit of a divisive election environment, and some right-wing nationalist groups do feel encouraged by elected officials who seem to be giving them sometimes some tacit approval, or perhaps even speaking to them in sub-languages that they identify with, almost as if they are being activated. Unfortunately, in the last couple of years, it has been a rough time in the United States when it comes to violent extremists. We're seeing a lot of different flavors of violent extremism. In addition to white supremacy, we're also seeing a lot more violence targeted at specific groups, like synagogue shootings, like church shootings, Dylann Roof targeting African Americans. So it's not unprecedented. We saw similar rises about 8 years ago, but we have sort of some new flavors that are on the scene. And predominantly, it's the groups I mentioned. It's the organization of neo-nationalists, white supremacists, and anti-government fringe movements that are embracing violence to not just further their cause, but to actually draw people to their agenda. What's very interesting, and I don't go into it in great depth in this presentation, is QAnon, which I'm sure you've all heard about and are all very savvy about. But QAnon is really a clearinghouse of misinformation. And it is the area in which conspiracy theories and racist rhetoric and neo-nationalist ideas get bandied about and gain traction and are repeated. Now, QAnon presents a very interesting challenge to communications, because while it absolutely protects the free speech of everyone, it also allows for a forum where hate and plans of violence can sort of foment and find like members or people who are curious about some of these more extremist ideas. We have consistently been able to try to tie back specific incidents to QAnon postings or QAnon encouragement or ideas or recruiting that occurred on QAnon. When we look at the recent kidnapping attempt of Governor Whitmer, it's QAnon where a lot of those gentlemen found each other. So I really want to have more of a conversation about what you're thinking about and what your perceptions are. And I wanted to just throw out some big questions. You know, what is the role of armed protesters? For me, I don't think that I anticipated that such a question would be prevalent. It never occurred to me that armed protesters would show up at otherwise peacefully planned events, either to defend the protesters themselves or to create an accelerationist clash of ideas. There's another big question that we need to talk about, which is how does law enforcement really deal with these agent provocateurs? How do you deal with agitators and rabble rousers that are upsetting otherwise peaceful agendas intentionally? And then, you know, the big ones, should we really be concerned about accelerationist agendas? Sometimes these movements burn themselves out without additional fuel, without oxygen. They sort of simmer and die. But, you know, how concerned should we be that a relatively large portion of right-wing neo-nationalist fringe movements in the United States are advocating for civil war and acting in an accelerationist capacity to make that happen? And then lastly, a question for all the ages is, you know, what is the consequence of encouraging or providing disinformation that leads to actual violence? These are some real questions about what kind of environment should we be encouraging and what are the limits of free speech when you're talking about targeting people. So I really want to open this up, and this is a policy pub and we're supposed to be at a bar. So let's have a casual conversation.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Casserleigh. We really appreciate it. We already have a few questions and a raised hand, so we'll jump in. Ross has a great question. Why do you think a lot of minorities are part of the Proud Boys if their ideals surround white nationalism?
Yes. So one of the theories is that minorities who join the Proud Boys may not be aware of their white supremacist roots. And the Proud Boys, as I mentioned, do advocate sometimes a platform where armed citizens need to pick up where official law enforcement have failed. So as you can imagine, that message may appeal to communities that do feel failed by law enforcement.
Okay. Nathan asks, you characterized fringe groups as causing death and noting that Antifa didn't make your list because of the lack of death. Yet old school terrorism was more focused on property crime and actively avoided murder. Can a group that exclusively damages property still be classified as a fringe group or a terrorist today?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. But when we look at the spectrum of who is the greatest threat, right now, Antifa doesn't rise to the litmus test that some of these other right nationalist groups do. But of course, absolutely, property damage. And sometimes, you know, just the real incredible threat of violence is enough to put you into the questioning category. You know, we should question your motives pretty seriously. Absolutely.
Okay, so Portia asks, has there been a surge in the number of armed protesters during the current presidential administration as compared to previous administrations? And just, Rachel, I do need some help with the raising of hands. I cannot access that on my computer. Sorry, go ahead.
So I am not sure what the level of armed protesters were during the Obama administration. I do know there was a rise in hate groups when President Obama was elected, but it's really unusual to see armed protesters at any event. Local law enforcement doesn't want any citizen rolling around armed in public, trying to either do their job or threaten them. So in general, local communities don't approve of any armed protesters anywhere, right? It just, regardless of your agenda, it's a very destabilizing presence. More importantly, we are in a legitimate era of serious gun violence. We have a lot of mass shooter events. So as you can well imagine, law enforcement does not want anybody waving guns around, whether they're peaceful or not. So I think that what's unusual for me is that in the protests that I've seen in the last couple of years, the presence of armed civilians is extraordinary to me. It's extraordinary to me. And it is also extraordinary to me that local officials didn't step in and asked all publicly armed citizens to put their arms away or go home. And I imagine it has a lot to do with their desire not to infringe on constitutionally protected rights or possibly even states' rights regarding being armed in public. But as a case point, there was an armed protester who showed up here in Tallahassee for one event, and law enforcement quickly de-escalated, removed his firearm, and pulled him away from the protest. And that is usually standard operating procedure when there's an armed individual in a crowd of people.
Yes, thank you. So thank you, Rachel. I thought James, I saw a first name James had his hand raised, but now the hand is gone. If you'd like, please raise your hand again. I'm also noticing there's a couple comments in the chat. If you can switch over to the Q&A section, that'd be wonderful. Otherwise, I will try to make my way that direction as well. So a great follow-up. Ronald asked, Dr. Casserleigh, in the event that President Trump loses the election, how do you expect these fringe groups to react? Should we be concerned?
It's a very good question. I don't want to make light of it, not at all. I'm going to go a little mea culpa. I don't know that I have a good answer for what communities are planning in the event of an armed uprising. I would imagine that it's a very serious, real, and credible threat for some communities more than others. I do know that the FBI has been incredibly proactive in infiltrating these groups. In fact, when you look at the Governor Whitmer kidnapping attempt, out of 14 individuals involved in that plan, 2 of them were undercover FBI agents. So I have a great deal of faith in our local law enforcement, and I have a great deal of faith in our federal law enforcement. And I also have a great deal of faith in humanity and our citizens. And I do believe that we should, well, I'm a constitutionalist, so I believe that we should respect the Constitution in all endeavors.
So Jonathan wonders, how does the sovereign citizens movement view the Black Lives Matter movement? I ask because Black Lives Matter is becoming increasingly anti-establishment, specifically anti-law enforcement.
Well, the sovereign citizens, oh boy, we teach about the sovereign citizens and it takes a lot longer than 20 minutes. They are at their core really about federal authority. They don't really respect federal authority, and they don't really respect state authority. They do things like print their own license plates and print their own driver's licenses And a lot of this is in an effort to not pay taxes, to be frank. Interestingly, their anti-establishment perspective has been attractive to an increasing number of minorities who do believe the federal government is overtaxing them or overreaching its authority. So while Black Lives Matter may have some disappointment in established security protocols in this country, minorities are also very attracted to the sovereign citizens because in some cases their beliefs align.
So we have two great questions about effect questions, sort of cause of an effect. So Diane wondered, what is the role of the internet in this? And William wondered, what about economic inequality and how is this potentially influencing fringe groups?
All right, well, the internet is just another forum. You know, I mean, I do look at the beauty of the internet as just another way to communicate. And if it weren't for the internet, we'd be writing letters, you know, so, and if it wasn't letters, we'd be sending smoke signals. So we're always, as humans, inclined to communicate, and we are always inclined to spread our ideas and to receive validation. So the internet, it's just another communication tool. But now the question about economic inequality is very, very interesting because there's some research that suggests that the majority of men who are attracted to fringe movements, like all these particular alt-right movements or neo-nationalist movements, and let me qualify, I'm not being sexist, I'm saying empirically, it's predominantly men that are attracted to these movements. It's predominantly white men. And it is also predominantly what we call working class men who feel sometimes that they have been disadvantaged economically, that other groups are surpassing them in economic achievements and that they are being left behind. So economic drivers are a very, very credible variable when we look at why an individual is attracted to fringe movements. It's an excellent question.
So a quick follow-up on that. Catherine wonders, is there a reason why men are more likely to join? Well, I don't know that I have a good answer for why more men. It's just that the research shows that it is predominantly men. I'm sorry, Catherine. It's a great question. I don't have a solid researched answer. I just know some of the variables that attract men, and a lot of times it's a feeling of powerlessness. So we have a couple of great comments and questions about potential deterrence. So would national red flag laws help deter violence from groups like Proud Boys? And what about the role of disinformation? If we could tamp down disinformation, would this potentially help?
Wow. Okay. So I love the red flag concept. We have to be very careful in how we approach restricting any kind of freedom of movement, freedom of association, freedom of speech. Like I said, I'm a big adherent to the Constitution. So we have to make sure that we're using good intelligence. And more importantly, I really think we have to step up our game with cross-pollination of intelligence. And I'll give you an example. Florida State is building sort of a real-time crime center. And one of its purposes is to allow a space where FSU Police Department, Tallahassee Police Department, and the Leon County Sheriff's Office can, in real time, share information about concerns or suspects or warrants. Because one of the things they found is that sometimes they'll be searching for someone, a suspect, and TPD will find that it has duplicated the efforts of LCSO. So that's a great example of where we really need to be cross-pollinating a lot of our intelligence. So I wouldn't say that we have intelligence failures. I would say we have more information now than we ever had before. We just got to be really good at collating it and using it appropriately.
So we have a bit terminology questions. So Angie asks, what are the chances that groups like Proud Boys will turn into distant terrorist groups, or are they already there? And then Felipe has a question about the 3%ers and says they're a militia group, but they claim that they are not anti-government and defenders of Second Amendment. However, they have engaged in intimidation of seated officials. Are they extremists? So there's some interesting case, but there also seems like people are wondering about these distinctions in terms and what gets you, when are you extremist versus a terrorist?
Okay, so first of all, love that question. What a brilliant plug. I know I have a bunch of my terrorism students out there, and I know that you're nudging me, so I appreciate that. So generally, an organization becomes a terrorist organization when they use violence to further their cause. They can also destroy property, or if they're providing a real, incredible threat of extraordinary violence. So I would boomerang that question to you and say, do some of these groups meet the definition of domestic terrorism? Are they using violence or the threat of greater violence to further their cause? And I think the answer could be yes, 100% yes. And I forgot the second question, I'm sorry.
So the one about the 3%ers as a militia group.
Absolutely. You know, I think one of the things I love most about FSU is that we really teach you some of these core concepts and then let you apply them in an evaluative manner. So if I tell you that a domestic terror group is using violence to further their cause, and that's how we define domestic terrorism, then I would boomerang that to you and say, do the 3%ers meet this threshold? Are their threats real and credible? Have they used real violence? And if they rise to that test, yes. The other thing that I like to always lean on is the professionals, because at the end of the day, I am a professor. And so I do look to lead agencies. I do look to the FBI for understanding who they consider very real and credible extremists in the United States. And I got to be honest with you, if the FBI says you're a violent extremist, you probably are.
I'm looking at if anyone needs to raise their hand to participate, please let me know. I've got that open and up. If you need to raise your hand, go ahead and do so and we'll get right with you. Okay, great. We have two. So three. So I'll pitch you Marianne's point first. She wonders how these hate groups differ from earlier groups, including the KKK, or later groups such as those including Timothy McVeigh, who carried out the Oklahoma City bombing.
Yes, well, it's a great question. So the Southern Poverty Law Center is really the preeminent organization for what they call hate maps in the United States. And what they do is really look at the origins of some of these groups. And as you can imagine, it's a bit like a Venn diagram. Neo-nationalists and white supremacists that were previously affiliated with the KKK do find acceptance with some of these other groups like the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo, and the Sovereign Citizens. So a lot of times it's almost like a Venn diagram where some of these organizations, that are in alignment, there's overlap between them and there's overlap between the members.
So Brandon, I've just unmuted you. You might have to also hit something, an unmute on the bottom of your screen, but you should be able to talk.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, well, I think she just actually went over the question a little bit, but my question was, how would law enforcement agencies categorize these agent provocateurs into different fringe groups, especially the Boogaloo, considering the decentralized nature of the movement and the widely disparate views held by people associated with it? So in other words, what is the minimum criteria to consider someone as a member of the Boogaloo as opposed to some other group with similar views? And can categorization into these groups overlap?
It's a great question. Brilliant. So there's a couple things inside of that question. One of the things really has to do with intelligence, good intelligence. We are often aware of individual actors with malintent. Good intelligence will reveal that. And if we're lucky, good intelligence will reveal their plan. So I want to sort of punt that back to our absolute need for solid intelligence about single actors or groups. And I don't know that group affiliation is as important as identifying actors or preventing events. And a lot of that sometimes can be done by mitigating their plans. If they're planning on rallying in Tallahassee and everybody bring their guns, call goes out on social media. And if we have good intelligence, then law enforcement can plan for that and they can help prevent things from escalating. That's one of the most important things we do. We do not run a specific domestic terror list in the United States because we do have freedom of affiliation and freedom of speech in this country. So there's not per se a list. And if you're affiliated with this group, you're automatically an agent provocateur or a terrorist by association. That's not how it works domestically in the United States. So I really think we need to be focusing not necessarily on the ideas, but more on the actors. Who's going to be a problem, where, why, and when?
All right, Matthew, I have unmuted you. You should be able to speak.
Hi, Dr. Casserleigh.
Hey!
Hey, so my question is, and I've asked you about this in class, but just a little plug. Is there a future for CVE programs, counter-violent extremism programs that could kind of sort of drive down the membership of these groups?
Okay, so Matt just needs a big warm hug for plugging some core concepts into his question. So he's mentioning Countering Violent Extremism was a program under the previous administration that was intended to provide additional dollars to communities to destigmatize law enforcement and allow them to build relationships with underserved or high-risk populations. So specifically, for example, in Minnesota, law enforcement was given money to engage with the large Somali refugee population that's living in Minnesota. And they bridge this gap because sometimes certain populations have a distrust of law enforcement and need to see them for the first time during peaceful encounters. Sometimes they need this support because they themselves are a target of radical movements and the law enforcement needs to engage with them during peaceful times so that they can help understand the issues, protect them better, mitigate any threats. It's a brilliant program that really looks at how do we best take advantage of existing resources by building communication and relationships with these communities that may perceive at risk or underserved. It's a brilliant idea and it had incredible success. Unfortunately, it has not been a priority under the current administration and that program has been cut. But Matthew brings up a great point. We traditionally used CVE to engage with Islamic communities in the United States so that they had a bridge to local law enforcement. But I see no reason why this same bridge couldn't be built between some of the more extremist movements and their concerns during peacetime and law enforcement. Same concept. Let's talk about what's a concern. Let's talk about what your triggers are before something happens. Let's break bread together. Let's talk. Let's get to know each other on an individual and human scale before we just let the ideas or issues run away from us with violence. So Matt, I think it's a brilliant program. I was a huge advocate, and I do think it has a place in countering some of these same extremist narratives that we see.
So Heather, you should be able to speak. Heather?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I was trying to figure it out.
It's okay.
Hey, Professor. Doesn't law enforcement already have a section that deals or handles the violent protest type events? And is there a way to try to get legal action against people that share disinformation, that causes and leads to violence?
Okay, so the two questions. Okay, so let me answer your first question. I am not aware of situations where people have been legally liable for inciting movements on forums like Reddit, QAnon, 4chan, etc. Okay, so I am not aware of legal culpability in these instances. And in fact, what was most interesting to me is that there are 14 congressmen that have supported QAnon, a pretty legitimate number. So I think you have some questions there about culpability that I don't know the answer to. The second thing regarding law enforcement and intelligence is a variable. Different jurisdictions have different resources. Our state runs a fusion center, it runs an intelligence cell at FDLE. But I know that also local law enforcement tries their best to get their hands around good intelligence at the local level. So it's really jurisdictionally dependent on how law enforcement approaches violent protesters or protesters.
This is sort of a related, I'll jump over here to Emily's comment because it's related. Are there bad actors in law enforcement sometimes? She wonders about the presence of armed protesters in Kenosha and how did law enforcement potentially encouraging them to turn up?
Yes, so the FBI has launched a new task force that is seeking specifically to examine the role of law enforcement in neo-nationalist white supremacist movements, because there have been an unfortunate number of documented cases where local law enforcement is sympathetic to violent extremists. And I know it's a large concern, and the Justice Department is looking at it as well. They should.
So James, I have unmuted you. You should be able to speak.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my question is a little bit different. I grew up in the 60s and 70s. I was part of the hippie movement, part of the anti-war movement. And we actually had groups that were subversive and that were on the left, the same kind of attitude that a lot of the extreme right were. And I have a question regarding the fact that Antifa, as unorganized as it is, does not match the tactics of the Weatherman faction. Whereas the Boogaloo boys do have a semi-formal communication group that allows them to coordinate their physical presence with weapons at sites.
I don't hear a question, but I agree with you, and the FBI agrees with you too.
So Morgan wonders about policy options. What policy options might be available to deal with potential extremists and potentially violent propensities of these groups without undermining the First Amendment rights?
It's a great question. It's a really great question because there is a fine line between espousing hatred and advocating for violence, specific acts of violence. It's a great question. And I don't know what the policy recommendations would be, because I do think we need to be very careful about infringing on beautiful rights that we have in this democracy. But yeah, I'm not sure what policy we need to address. I'm not sure.
So Christy wonders if you could talk a bit more about how activist groups might decide who to target and when to attack. She says that she's a bit more surprised that there aren't more attacks if the goal is to escalate.
I agree. I think that there's two possible variables that may contribute to what you're looking for. One, we are genuinely not sure about the strength and organizations of some of these groups. The Boogaloo, for example, their founder has been involved and then disavowed and then been involved again. So it's very difficult for us to even pin down sometimes who the leadership is. The other problem is that some of their numbers may be self-inflated. They may be engaging in rhetoric in their own sound vacuums because we agree with you. There's not, given what we know, why are there not more, right? If this is really their agenda, why is there not more? The other possible answer is that it doesn't benefit them. That if you're really after a neo-nationalist white supremacist agenda, then calling attention to your movement by public acts of violence, which will get you arrested or get attention on your group, is not necessarily conducive to your end goal. So there's two kinds of possible variables that could be contributing to your question.
So I'm jumping around, folks. I really appreciate some of you have so many questions. It's wonderful, but I want to make sure I cover a range of voices. And so Helena asks, she says that she recently saw in the news, which you mentioned, some government officials who are endorsing QAnon and wonders how worried should we be about this?
I don't know. I do think that these are fringe groups. One of their new concepts in QAnon is the idea that the pandemic is a fake. They call it the plandemic. And it's got a variety of conspiracy theories, a whole rainbow of conspiracy theories behind it. But the problem with conspiracy theories is that if you don't give them, again, oxygen or fuel, they tend to die out because they can't really survive contact with the truth. And so I would just encourage us to communicate more. I mean, I really think that when we look at problems and we look at conflict, the solution quite often is an increase in communication.
So Stephanie wonders if you had any comment about the Proud Boys allegedly sending voters intimidating emails and saying that they had people's personal information and telling them how to vote, otherwise there would be consequences.
Okay, so Emily, here's my question for you. Is that cyber terrorism? I don't know. Listen, if you're threatening somebody to discourage them from exercising their right to vote, that's a very serious infraction.
So Esther wonders how much, if any, has the deprioritization of the CVE program been linked to the uptick in the incidence of extremism from 2019 to 20?
No, not at all. Not at all. CVE was a separate program that was really meant to be an outreach to the Islamic community. And what we're predominantly seeing now when it comes to community level violence is neo-nationalist and white supremacists.
So Logan gets back to something you said a bit earlier about communications among the agencies. And so he's wondering how well is the communication among the agencies regarding these fringe groups, and what is it that might make the communication better?
Money. It's always about money. So you can't prioritize everything. So I would say that we tend to put our resources where the greatest threat is. And that's probably as it should be. So if you really want to talk about greater intelligence or more resources or community programs that encourage communication, it really comes down to money. It's all about political will, which translates to money.
So Marian asks, do you think that the Russians or Chinese, et cetera, are supporting some of these groups in an effort to destabilize the country?
Okay, not these groups, no. These are very, very American groups. I don't think that at this point they enjoy either foreign influence or foreign support. However, the state of disarray in this country with armed protesters does give aid and comfort to our enemies.
So Chris wonders, what's the probability of a civil war?
Low, I hope. None, I hope.
So Diane asks, does our current administration waffling on some of these groups fuel the anger and activism of the groups?
It has been an interesting challenge to see the current POTUS not disavow fringe elements. And I do think that we shouldn't take lightly any encouragement of civilian violence.
So Nathan wonders, is there a geographical trend of where these movements are located? Rural versus urban, high population states versus low population, maybe even proximity to FBI field offices or other law enforcement centers?
Okay, so yeah, everybody's got a little bit of their own thing. So sovereign citizens are wildly popular in rural and Midwest, but they've also had a presence in urban areas. Some of the organizations are very geo-exclusive. For example, like when we talk about Antifa, it's almost exclusively that we've seen action on the West Coast. So they are definitely gaining traction as national movements, but they do have what we call hotspots. And every organization has some of their own hotspots.
So Emily wonders, if we discover who Q is, could they be prosecuted, or could they argue that they're practicing their freedom of speech?
I would argue that they're practicing their freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is fine until it becomes hate speech or it's actually inciting violence. But up until that point, you do have a right in this country to express your political views.
So Brandon asks, how do law enforcement agencies categorize agent provocateurs into these fringe groups, particularly the Boogaloo, considering the decentralized nature of the movement and the widely disparate views held by the people associated with it? In other words, what is the minimum criteria to consider someone as a member of the Boogaloo as opposed to some other group with similar views?
I think we had that question before. And as I mentioned, there is no minimum criteria, nor is it a crime to be affiliated with an organization, even if they are domestic dissident group. So again, law enforcement is looking at actors. It's looking for people who are actually armed, actually encouraging others to show up, conduct violence, intimidate. They are not looking for the minimum criteria of your membership. That's not a litmus test under the law.
Our last question or comment will be live from Angie. You should be able to speak.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hello. I had a question about, like, I know there are many groups, like such as white supremacists, white nationalists, white extremists, sovereign citizen, anti-government, all these names. I wanted to know, how does the separation between this group work? And like, do they sometimes overlap with the distinction, or can they be neatly placed into different buckets?
No, there's a great deal of overlap. And again, a lot of these organizations, you can almost think of them as Venn diagrams with very active participants that will engage with multiple groups.
Yeah, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
This evening, and thank you so much, Dr. Casserleigh, for your talk. Just a quick note for those folks that enjoyed this event and want to know about some of our upcoming events. Hopefully you can see, can you see a slide? that says we have a talk, and you can use the QR code at the bottom. Some folks add some interesting follow-up questions about our last webinar that was on COVID. And so we have several faculty in the college that have already published research or in the progress of doing research. So next week, there will be another webinar free on Wednesday at 4 p.m. on the COVID effect, featuring different faculty doing research from public administration to sociology and urban regional planning. And our last official policy pub will be after the election on the 17th, same time, same place, wherever you want that place to be. And it will be on campaigns in the new environment. So a retrospective of political campaigns in 2020. Here again is the QR code that you can grab up. Again, you need to pre-register for the events. If you're ever interested in learning more about what we're doing and what students are doing and what our graduate students are researching and what folks are teaching in the classroom, please check out our blog, Wicked Problems, Wicked Solutions, and you can see just some of the work that we have going on right now. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Casserleigh. Thank you so much for all the insight and great conversation. We hope to see you all again. Bye.